Hi, guys. Mrs. Womack and Mr. Shaw coming at you on fall break.
You think we can get like a dual Teacher of the Year situation going on?
I think we could.
Okay, get your votes in now, guys.
Yeah. All right, so we're today going to go over the presidency part 2. Here we go. All right, the president has many roles that he plays, and one of them is going to be called chief legislator. Okay, so he has to work really closely with Congress, and one of his major powers that he has is the power to veto a bill that Congress sends to him. Okay, so a couple different kinds of vetoes. He can just do a straight up veto when the bill comes to him. He can say, nope, don't like it, veto. Or he has the power to use what's called a pocket veto. And that's where he basically has 10 days to respond to a bill. If the congressional session is completed within those 10 days, then that bill will automatically be killed.
And you should know too that if whenever the president does veto a bill, he does. It's not the end of the story. We've talked about the ability of Congress to override a veto. However, that is specifically called a legislative veto. So we're finally putting a name to that. So make sure it's not a legislative veto. Is not a power of the president. It is when the president's veto has been overridden. Also, there's no line item veto, which literally means that they can just cross out parts of a bill or veto parts of a bill while passing others. Most governors have that ability.
Yes.
However, the president does not, which we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah, the Supreme Court declared line item veto unconstitutional in the 1990s. Okay, and then another thing the president will do is issue a signing statement. And it just basically tells Congress and then the public how the president feels about that bill, or how he feels that bill will be implemented, okay, as it becomes a law.
So, and with signing statements too, like if the president and Congress are different parties and the president knows that his veto will be overridden, it makes him look kind of bad if he vetoes a bill and it gets overridden. So sometimes he'll pass a bill and then he'll write a signing statement and he'll say, hey, I'm not really cool with this bill or certain parts of this bill, but I'm going to pass it anyway. And it just basically lets the public and Congress know what his thoughts are on it.
Yes, and then one more thing, the president has the power of an executive order. And this is basically issuing something into law without actually going through the lawmaking process. So the president can give something the force of law without actually going through the long, drawn-out lawmaking process and having to go through both houses of Congress.
But it's not. It's the kind of thing that it still is subject to judicial review.
Correct.
So it's not really like an easier way of making a law. We have seen presidents go to the executive order a lot more often now.
Yes.
Usually when we have a divided government.
That's correct.
So again, it's kind of a weird thing. Like you can issue the executive order, but you have to be really careful with what you do it on. It's usually going to be in times of crisis, like when things need to happen immediately, whereas more laws that are going to stay laws need to be passed by Congress.
Right. And this is just a chart that you can kind of look at and analyze a little bit, and it just gives the amount of vetoes that each president has done in the last 50 years or so. And notice how the pocket veto is now not as much of a thing.
It's going away. Congress is basically not sending bills to the president within 10 days because it makes them look bad that they've worked on something for months and months. But you see, again, when we go all the way back to the 50s with Eisenhower, he was pocket vetoing things like crazy, probably because there was a lot of division in Congress during that time.
Yes. Okay, next role of the president is going to be called chief of party. So he is the face of his political party. Okay, and he has to work very closely with Congress for many reasons. He wants to influence policy. He has his own legislative agenda, and it's going to bode well for him if he has a close connection with Congress, and he can influence any kind of policy that Congress is going to shape. Okay, so he's going to rely on members of his own party to kind of bridge the gap between the executive and the legislative branch, and to help with his implementation of his legislative agenda. And obviously, members of Congress that are in the same party as the president, if the president is popular, they can definitely benefit from having that close relationship with the president. And it's something called presidential coattails that happens a lot. Members of Congress, often, if it's a popular president, we're going to see an influx of the same party members of Congress getting elected during that same election cycle.
So we'll see in about a month, a little less than a month now, like kind of where Donald Trump, like his presidential approval ratings are fairly low. So we don't know how that's going to turn out for the representatives in the midterm elections. So we might what we're guessing is going to happen is probably going to have an influx of Democrats into Congress, but we're not really sure just because we don't know much of anything that's going on anymore. So
right, we thought we knew in 2016, but we were wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens there. But again, the president is going to be the most important party member, and his success is definitely going to drive the success of the party, and vice versa.
Okay, and then we're going to continue with chief of party in regards to public support. So obviously, public support is key to a president's success. We just kind of talked about Donald Trump. He doesn't have a very high approval rating, so we will see how that bodes for him when we get to the November midterm elections. Representatives are much more likely to vote in favor of the initiative of a president who is popular with the people, because you kind of have to think those representatives are going to have, they're going to get good feedback from their constituents. If they like the president and the representatives are voting with the president, that's a good thing. Okay. A popular president's policies are more likely to be followed in Congress, and then that kind of grants a legitimacy to the presidency. Okay, if people like the president, they're going to be more on board with his policy.
And I think it just goes back to the idea that the more popular a president is, the more people are going to care about what he wants to do. A president that's not very popular, to be honest with you guys, is just not going to get a lot done, because the representatives in Congress they're not going to feel a lot of pressure from their constituents to follow along with with the policy goals or policy agenda of the president, because they're worried about getting reelected themselves, and they don't want to follow along with maybe an unpopular president.
Okay. Then we move to the president as chief diplomat. So he is the face of the United States, and he represents the United States with the rest of the world. So he has the power to recognize foreign governments by sending ambassadors to those different governments. He also has a power, and it's called an informal power, called an executive agreement. And that's basically when he makes some type of an agreement with another head of state. This is not going to require congressional approval. It cannot undo a prior treaty or an act of Congress, but it is an agreement that the president has the power to make with another country if necessary.
And again, it's not really the kind of thing that's they're not gonna make some huge deal about like nuclear weapons or something with an executive agreement. For the most part, as the book mentions, executive agreements are about food exchanges, or things that are usually pretty routine, non-controversial. Although we have seen a couple, for example, the end of the Vietnam War was an executive agreement because that was never a formal declaration of war. So that one was pretty intense. Also, the SALT Treaty in the 80s with Reagan was a really big deal. So we have seen some where they have been a big deal, but like I said, usually they're not. And treaties are the exact same thing, except that they do require the Senate approval, the 2/3 Senate approval, in fact. so it is very difficult to get those treaties ratified. However, most senators are probably going to agree that it's pretty important to ratify those treaties.
Yeah, and another thing to note is that executive agreements are going to be more on a temporary basis, and treaties are going to be more on a permanent basis.
Yeah, seems good.
Okay. Okay, then we get to the president as commander-in-chief. So he has a couple different powers here. Military powers, okay, are going to give him the power to decide when using weapons, specifically weapons of mass destruction. He can authorize military actions during war. Okay, he can send troops into specific areas of conflict. However, we know that the formal declaration of war has to come from Congress. The president cannot formally declare war. Okay, he can send troops, but he cannot actually say we are in a war with this country. Okay, so that leads us to something called the War Powers Act of 1973. Sometimes it's called the War Powers Resolution. And this gives the president the ability to send troops into a foreign country or into a conflict for up to 60 days without actually getting that declaration of war from Congress. Now, at the end of that 60 days, he either has to get Congress to declare war or the troops will be withdrawn. Okay, and this was done in the 1970s to kind of limit the power of the presidency to commit troops to any kind of U.S. conflict. But a lot of presidents kind of ignore this. They see it as unconstitutional because in the Constitution, the president does have the power of commander-in-chief. So presidents want their powers in regard to that to be expanded, but Congress likes to keep them limited. So it's kind of a back and forth situation.
The War Powers Act, guys, what you really need to know is that in the late 60s, early 70s, we were fighting Vietnam, and that was an entirely undeclared war, as we mentioned earlier. So basically, President Johnson had sent troops over to Vietnam, and they had been fighting for almost a decade without congressional approval. And this was basically the War Powers Act is a response to what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that gave the president the ability to fight in an undeclared war. And then they realized in 1973, this was a terrible idea. We have to really curtail the president's power here to make sure that that this can't happen again. So now, when the president sends troops anywhere, he has to notify Congress within 48 hours of doing so, or he needs to withdraw those troops within those 48 hours, or within 60 days, as long as he has notified Congress.
One more thing to note about the War Powers Act, when it was sent to the president in 1973, Richard Nixon actually vetoed it, and this is a great example of a legislative veto where Congress overrode that presidential veto with a 2/3 vote.
Right, and why would Nixon agree to to getting his powers, stripped
Limited.
away from him? So it makes sense that he would veto it, but this was a very popular act among congressmen because they wanted to fix what they had started with Johnson.
And we were in a time at that point where the public was getting kind of skeptical of the presidency because what's the word I'm looking for? They lost trust. They lost trust in the presidency because of some things that had gone on with the Johnson presidency.
Sure. And then it's only going to get worse with Watergate.
Yeah. Okay, moving to president as crisis manager. Sometimes it's also called chief citizen. So he is in charge of obviously dealing with any kind of crises that might occur during his presidency. And we've seen many, many examples of this. We can talk about JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Iran hostage crisis with Jimmy Carter, and then how President Bush dealt with 9/11. It's really, that role has become much easier to execute with the incorporation of modern technology. The president has a much easier way to reach out to the American public and try to kind of ease their stress and their pain that they're feeling.
And we've seen this, guys, just this is a really straightforward role of the president. I mean, obviously, the president, as a single person, is going to be in charge of handling crises as they come up. Again, this is what we're talking about in Federalist 70 with again Alexander Hamilton talking about the need for a single executive. We want to make sure that we have somebody who can respond to these crises in a quick and efficient manner, because we know that nothing about Congress is quick or efficient.
Right. Okay.
Oh, we lost one. Oh well, that's okay. Okay.
Okay, so the president, in regards to working with Congress, we kind of say there's two different presidencies: domestic policy, and then we have foreign policy. So the president kind of has to come off as having a united front when it comes to the rest of the government, especially when it comes to foreign policy and national security, because we want to be seen in regards to the rest of the world as a united front with the United States. We're all together on the same page. Congress is so large that we say Congress kind of has a reactive role when it comes to foreign policy, and they're going to kind of oversee presidential actions that he might take with other leaders or other governments. And then Congress kind of takes the lead when it comes to domestic policy. They're going to shape policy to help out the American people in just different regards of everyday life. And then, but congressional support is a major, major thing when it comes to presidential success in both foreign and domestic policy.
And since what we talk about a lot with foreign policy is that Congress, they don't ever come up with foreign policy on their own. They usually will criticize or support the president's policies, but they're like I said, they're like Ms. Womack said, there's not really a lot of leeway that they have in creating it. However, they are the representatives of the people. So when it comes to domestic policy, what we see is that Congress really will take the lead with that and make sure that the types of policies that not only the president wants, but that Congress is actually implementing is going to be what the people actually want, because, as I said, they are representatives of the people. I think that's it.
Okay.
Okay. Hey, guys, we're all done.
Woo!
In like half the time almost. You're welcome.
17 minutes. Oh, yeah. Another high five.
Okay. Guys,
Right.
catch you next time. Take it easy.